My brother got a standing ovation. I got a parking validation ticket and drove home alone on the 401 with the heat on full blast because I was shaking so hard I couldn't feel my hands. They didn't know about my condo in Hamilton, my promotion at the firm, the savings account I'd been building since I was 22, the therapist I saw every other Thursday in a small office on James Street North. The life I'd built, quietly, without any of them watching. My brother laughed. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not my father's voice through the mic, though that comes back too, believe me, but my brother's laugh. Bright and easy, the way it always was, like he'd heard the funniest thing in the world. I am 31 years old, and I am just now learning that I am not a placeholder. Let me go back. My parents had 2 children. My brother Kyle was born 18 months before me, and from the moment I could understand language, I understood this. Kyle was the point, I was the footnote. Not because anyone ever said it out loud, that would have been too honest for my family, but because of the thousand small ways it showed up every single day. At dinner, my father asked Kyle about hockey, about his friends, about what he thought of the Leafs' chances that year. He asked me to pass the salt. My mother bought Kyle a car when he turned 16. For my 16th birthday, she handed me a card with $40 in it and said she'd been busy. Kyle's university applications got reviewed by both my parents, sitting at the kitchen table with highlighters, treating it like a project. Mine, I filled out alone in my bedroom on a Sunday night while they watched a movie downstairs. I am not telling you this looking for sympathy. I am telling you this because you need to understand the texture of it. It wasn't screaming or cruelty or any of the dramatic things people imagine when they think about a childhood like this. It was quieter than that. It was my mother turning to ask Kyle a question in the middle of a sentence I was speaking. It was my father's face going still whenever I entered a room, like someone had turned the volume down. It was being 15 years old and realizing that I had to make myself interesting enough to justify taking up space and failing and trying again the next day. I left for university in Guelph when I was 18. I studied civil engineering. I was good at it, really good. And that mattered to me in a way I couldn't have articulated then, but understand now completely. Being good at something that had nothing to do with them felt like oxygen. I came home for holidays because that's what you do. I sat at the table. I passed the salt. I drove back to Guelph and exhaled somewhere around Milton. Kyle stayed in Toronto. Got a job in sales, did okay, lived 20 minutes from my parents. My father mentioned him in almost every phone call. Kyle just got a new account. Kyle's thinking about buying a place in Etobicoke. Kyle and I saw the game last night. I listened. I said that's great in the right places. I started calling less. By the time I was 25, I called once a month. By 27, every 6 weeks. It wasn't dramatic. There was no fight, no confrontation, no moment of reckoning. I just stopped filling a role that no one had ever actually valued. Then Kyle announced he was getting married. Her name was Priya. She was warm and funny, and I liked her immediately, which made everything that happened harder in a way I didn't expect. She was good for him. You could see it, the way he straightened up around her, paid attention, tried. I wanted them to be happy. I genuinely did. The wedding was in September at a vineyard in Niagara-on-the-Lake. 230 guests. It was the kind of wedding that takes a year to plan and costs more than a down payment, which my parents helped fund because of course they did. Kyle called me 3 times during the planning process, once to tell me the date, once to ask if I could do a reading. I said yes, once to confirm my dietary restrictions. I drove out on the Friday, checked into a bed and breakfast on the main street, had dinner alone at a restaurant on the water, and told myself this was fine. This was just a weekend. I could do this. The ceremony was beautiful. I did the reading. My voice was steady. Priya cried. Kyle looked at her the whole time. The reception was in the vineyard's main hall, long wind tables and Edison bulbs and mason jars of wildflowers. I found my place card and discovered I was at table 14. Not the head table, not the family table. Table 14, with Kyle's colleagues from his old job and a cousin twice removed whose name I had to read off the card. I sat down. I smiled. I introduced myself. I had a glass of wine. My father gave his speech just after dinner. He was wearing a dark suit, and he'd had his hair cut, and he looked the way fathers are supposed to look at their children's weddings. He tapped the mic once, grinned at the crowd, and started talking about Kyle, about the kind of son he was, how proud he made them, how he'd always known Kyle would build something good. And then he paused. He looked out at the room, 230 people with their glasses in their hands, candlelight on their faces, and he said, "God gave us 2 kids." I think he was being especially generous with this one. He meant it as a compliment to Kyle. The room laughed. My brother laughed. My brother laughed. I sat very still for approximately 4 seconds. I counted them. 4 seconds of sitting at table 14 with a smile frozen on my face, my wine glass in my hand, while 230 people laughed at a joke that required me to be the punchline. That required me to be less, to be the proof that Kyle was more. Then I set down my glass, carefully. I picked up my clutch. I stood up, walked toward the side exit, and stepped out into the September night. The air was cool. Grapes and wood smoke. Behind me, through the doors, I could hear the clinking of glasses starting up, the swell of conversation. Someone had put on music. I heard her heels on the flagstone before I heard her voice. "Where are you going?" My mother's voice. Slightly breathless. She'd moved fast. "Home," I said. "You can't leave. It's Kyle's wedding. Dad just told 200 people I was the consolation prize." She exhaled. Not a sigh of understanding. The other kind, the sharp one she made when I'd done something inconvenient. "He was making a toast, Meredith. He wasn't talking about you. He literally said they had 2 kids and God was generous with one of them. You're being too sensitive." I looked at her for a long moment. The vineyard lights caught the rhinestones at her collar. She was wearing the earrings Kyle had given her for Christmas 3 years ago. She'd mentioned that twice this weekend. She was looking at me with that expression I knew better than almost anything, the one that said, "Why are you making this harder than it needs to be?" "I'm going home," I said. "Meredith, tell Kyle congratulations. Tell Priya I think she's wonderful. I mean that." I walked to the parking lot, got in my car, turned on the heat because September in Niagara gets cold at night and I was shaking, though not from the temperature. I drove home on the QEW and then the 403 and then the surface streets to Hamilton, and I cried for maybe 20 minutes somewhere around Burlington, and then I stopped. Not because I felt better, because I was done. When I got back to my condo, I sat on the floor of my living room for a while. I have a good living room. Hardwood floors, a couch I picked out myself, a print on the wall that I bought at a market in Kensington 2 summers ago. It looked exactly like my life. It had nothing to do with them. I blocked my parents' numbers that night. I didn't block Kyle. I told myself I was leaving that door open. What I really mean is I didn't know what I wanted from him yet, and I needed time to figure it out. He didn't call. Not the next day, not that week, not in the month that followed. I checked sometimes to see if he'd tried. A text, a voicemail, anything. Nothing. I told myself this was useful information. I filed it away. I poured everything into work. I was already doing well at the engineering firm, but that winter I became exceptional. I led a project on a stormwater management system in Brantford that came in under budget. My manager, a methodical man from Edmonton named Ross, told me it was the cleanest project documentation he'd seen in 5 years. I went home that evening and sat on my kitchen floor and cried again, but this time I wasn't sure why. I started seeing my therapist twice a month instead of once. Her name was Dr. Obasi, and she had a fern on the windowsill, and she never told me what to feel about my family. She just asked me questions until I figured it out myself. I started figuring out quite a lot. The years went by in the way that years go when you're doing the work. Slowly, and then not slowly at all. I got promoted. I bought a 2 bedroom's worth of furniture that I'd been putting off for 2 years. I ran a half marathon in the spring. Badly, but I finished. I had good friendships, real ones, built over time with people who asked me how I was doing and listened to the answer. I did not see my parents. Occasionally, one of them would call from a number I didn't recognize, and I would listen to the voicemail, and I would decide not to call back. My mother's messages were variations on the same theme. I don't understand why you're doing this to us. My father left 2 messages in 3 years. Both were short. Neither was an apology. I was okay. I want to be clear about that. Not performing okay, not convincing myself I was okay, but actually, genuinely arriving at okay through a lot of difficult and necessary work. And then, 5 years and 3 months after the wedding, I got a text from my cousin Tasha. 3 words. Call me. Kyle. I stared at it for a long time. I called her back from my car, parked outside a grocery store in Hamilton, engine running. Tasha took a breath before she started talking. That breath told me something was wrong before any of the words did. Kyle had been drinking. Not the way everyone drinks. Not glasses of wine at dinner or beers at a hockey game. The other kind. The kind that starts at noon and ends badly. It had been going on, apparently, for a couple of years. Priya had left him 8 months ago. He was in the house in Etobicoke. Her name was off the mortgage now. And he wasn't going to work and he wasn't answering most calls. And my parents were scared and not handling it. And the family thought maybe I should talk to him. Why me? I asked. Tasha was quiet for a moment. Because everyone else has already tried. I sat in the parking lot for a while after we hung up. A woman walked past my car with a cart full of groceries. A kid on a bike. Ordinary Tuesday afternoon in Hamilton. I thought about my therapist, about what she'd said once, carefully, when I'd asked her what it meant to set boundaries. She said, a boundary isn't about punishing someone, it's about knowing what you can offer and what it costs you. I thought about what it would cost me to drive to Etobicoke, what it would cost me not to. I did not call my parents. I want to be very clear about that. I called Kyle directly. I found his number in my contacts. I'd never deleted it. It rang 4 times and I was preparing for voicemail when he picked up. He sounded like someone who hadn't slept properly in months, which I would learn he hadn't. Hey, he said. Hey, I said. Neither of us said anything for a moment. I heard, I said. I'm not calling to lecture you. I'm calling to ask if you want help. Another silence, long enough that I thought he might hang up. I don't know how, he said. That's okay. I can figure out the how if you want the help. He said yes. It took him a while to get there. There was a long exhale and something that might have been crying or just exhaustion. And then, yes, I spent the next 2 evenings on the phone with addiction services in Toronto. Booked him a consultation at a treatment center in Mississauga that a doctor colleague of Dr. Abbasi's had mentioned once. I texted Kyle the address and the time and told him I'd meet him there. He showed up. That was the first thing. He showed up. The intake process took most of the day. I sat in the waiting area for 3 hours reading the same article on my phone over and over without taking any of it in. When he came out and said he'd been accepted into their 30-day residential program, I nodded and said good, and then went to the bathroom and stood over the sink for a while. On the way to his car, I said, I want to tell you something. Okay. I'm not doing this because the family asked me to. I'm doing this because you picked up the phone and you showed up today, and that's worth something to me. He looked at me, really looked, the way people rarely do. I didn't know what happened. That night, at the wedding. I didn't know why you left. You laughed, I said. It wasn't an accusation, it was just true. He was quiet. I know, he said. I'm sorry. We stood in the parking lot for a moment. The November wind off the lake. A plane crossing overhead on its way to Pearson. I'm not going back to Mom and Dad, I said. I want to be honest with you about that. I have boundaries with them that I need to keep, but I'm not blocked to you. Why not? I thought about it. Because you answered. And because I think you might actually want to be different. He entered the program the following Monday. I drove him. I kept his spare key. I watered the one plant left alive in his kitchen, a stubborn little succulent on the windowsill, still hanging on despite everything, and went home. I didn't tell my parents any of this. They called Tasha. Tasha told them he was getting help and left it at that. My mother called my old number twice that week. I let it go to voicemail. The first message was asking if I knew where Kyle was. The second one was telling me that whatever I thought I was doing, I was being cruel to the family. I listened to both messages standing in my kitchen in Hamilton. Then I put my phone down and made dinner. Kyle called me from the treatment center on day 12. He wasn't supposed to. They had a limited call window, but he'd saved it for me. He said the therapy was hard. He said he was sleeping better than he had in years. He said he'd been thinking about something his counselor told him, that the people who get better are usually the ones who can name what they were running from. "What were you running from?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Feeling like I had to be perfect for them," he said. Like one wrong move and the whole thing would collapse. I didn't know what I was holding until I couldn't hold it anymore. I thought about that for a long time after we hung up, about how the same family can damage two people in completely different directions. How my parents had crushed me by making me invisible, and crushed Kyle by making him the only thing that mattered. How none of us had come out of it without damage. I am not a forgiving person by nature. I want to be honest about that. I have worked very hard in therapy to understand the difference between forgiving and releasing, between letting people back in and simply stopping the work of hating them. I have not forgiven my parents. I am not certain I ever will. But I have released the story where they are the central characters. They don't get to be that anymore. Kyle finished the program in December. He called me the day he got home and we talked for almost 2 hours about nothing important and everything that mattered. He was applying to go back to his job part-time. He was going to meetings. He had a sponsor, a retired electrician from Scarborough named Don, who called him every morning at 7:30. We have dinner once a month now, nothing dramatic. A restaurant, usually. We talk about his recovery and my work and books and sometimes just whatever. He doesn't ask me about our parents, and I don't offer. We're building something new, slowly, on different ground than where we started. Last spring, I ran the half marathon again. Better this time. I called Kyle at the finish line, still out of breath, and he laughed and said, "I can't believe you kept doing that." I said I was stubborn. He said, "Yeah, you always were." He meant it as a compliment. I took it as one. I am 31 years old and I live alone in Hamilton in a condo with hardwood floors and a print from Kensington on the wall, and a therapist I see twice a month and a life that is entirely my own. It is not the life anyone built for me. It is not the life anyone built for me. It is not the life I was handed or assigned or granted. I built it in the gaps between being overlooked. One quiet decision at a time. I am not a throwaway. I never was. And I am done waiting for the people who couldn't see that to finally come around. Some doors you close not out of anger, but out of self-respect. That's the part I wish someone had told me sooner. I think about the parking lot in Mississauga a lot. Not the treatment center itself. Not the intake forms or the waiting room or the 3 hours I spent rereading the same article on my phone. But the moment after, when Kyle and I were standing outside in the November wind, and he looked at me and said he hadn't known why I left that night. 5 years. He hadn't known. That's the thing about families that don't talk. Everyone ends up carrying a version of events that nobody else recognizes. What I've learned, slowly, and not without a lot of Thursday afternoons on Dr. Toons, Abazai's couch, is that the choices we make when we're in pain tell us something true about who we are. When my father made that toast, I had 2 options. I could have stayed. Smiled. Let it pass the way I'd let 1,000 small things pass before it. Or I could have done what I actually did, decided, quietly, that I was worth more than that moment. That first choice, the choice to leave, to stop performing okayness I didn't feel. That was the beginning of something. Not the revenge, not the distance, the honesty. I am not a naturally brave person. I want to be clear about that. The version of me who drove home on the 401 that night wasn't brave. She was exhausted. But exhaustion can look a lot like courage from the outside, and sometimes you have to act before you know which one it is. What came after? The condo, the promotion, the therapy, the half marathons I ran badly and then less badly. None of that happened because I was particularly strong. It happened because I kept making the next right decision, even when I didn't feel like it. even when the next right decision was just getting out of bed and going to work. Doing the thing in front of me. Not because it felt meaningful, but because meaning has a way of showing up later, after the doing. When Kyle called me from the treatment center on day 12 and said he was learning to name what he'd been running from, I recognized something in that. We had both been running, him toward the pressure of being the golden child, me away from the weight of being invisible. Different directions, same broken starting point. And we had both, eventually, had to stop running and just stand there in whatever was true. The people who talk about karma like it's a scoreboard miss the point, I think. It's not that the universe keeps track and balances the ledger. It's simpler than that. The choices you make shape who you become, and who you become determines what you're able to build. My parents made choices, small ones, daily ones, for years that made them smaller people, not as punishment, just as consequence. And I made choices, also small, also daily, that made me someone who could show up in a Mississauga parking lot and mean it. Kyle is going to meetings. He calls Dawn every morning. We have dinner once a month, nothing dramatic, and we talk like two people who are figuring out how to be related to each other on honest terms for the first time. I think that's enough. I think that might actually be everything. Some doors you close not because you've stopped caring, but because you've finally started caring about the right things. And some people you let back in not because they've earned it in the way you imagined, but because they showed up, imperfect, late, trying. And that turned out to be enough to work with. I am not done becoming who I'm going to be. Neither is he. That's the part that still surprises me a little.